Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourself for a roller coaster of secrets, lies, and jaw-dropping revelations. In this explosive tale, a powerful millionaire stands in the center of a courtroom storm. On one side, a cunning mistress claims to be pregnant with his child, wielding her story like a weapon. On the other side, his dignified, long-suffering wife arrives clutching a DNA test that threatens to unravel everything. What will happen when these two women finally collide in a battle of wits and wills? Brace yourself, because the shocking twist that unfolds will leave you speechless. Welcome to a riveting saga where truth fights tooth and nail to topple deception. Richard Harrington was not merely a wealthy man. He was a titan in the high-stakes world of corporate real estate and strategic investments. 42 years old, tall and commanding, he possessed a presence that demanded attention the moment he stepped into a room. In New York's glittering social circles, the Harrington name carried weight, for Richard and his family owned sprawling properties from Manhattan to the Hamptons and beyond. Private jets, chauffeured limousines, and lavish parties at the Carlyle Hotel in Manhattan had become part of his public persona. But if anyone asked him, Richard would insist that he was just a hard-working businessman who seized the right opportunities. He came from humble beginnings in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Queens, raised by a single mother who believed in grit and education. Through scholarships, he attended Columbia University, where he honed the art of turning bold risks into unstoppable success. By 30, he had built an impressive portfolio of commercial properties. By 40, he was well on his way to becoming a billionaire. Richard's wife, Elizabeth Harrington, was just as captivating. With a background in finance, she was no pushover. In fact, before they married, she worked for one of the most prestigious hedge funds on Wall Street, Davidson and Levitt. Her intelligence was matched only by her grace, and she quickly became the bedrock of Richard's personal and professional life. Over the years, Elizabeth transitioned into a more supportive role, assisting in charitable work, heading the Harrington Foundation, and occasionally offering sharp insights into Richard's deals. Yet those who truly knew her understood that Elizabeth had an indomitable spirit not to be trifled with. As the Harringtons soared through life's upper echelons, that image of a picture-perfect power couple radiated through every gala invitation and every charity dinner. Elizabeth's philanthropic endeavors were widely covered in glossy magazines, praising her for her elegance and generosity. Photographs of the two, Richard in a tailored Brioni suit and Elizabeth in a timeless Valentino gown, adorned many society columns. They were a power couple, admired from afar, even envied. But behind the glamorous facade, the Harrington marriage had its cracks. Pressure from the media, the stress of expansions, and the occasional rumor of flirtation or wrongdoing placed ongoing strain on their once warm and stable relationship. The cracks were invisible to most, but to Elizabeth they were painfully clear, a slow fracturing beneath the surface that made her nights sleepless and her days fraught with an undercurrent of anxiety. Their world was about to be shaken to its core, for some ambition burns like a constant flame, a warm glow. For Catherine Maxwell, it was a wildfire, raging, consuming and relentless. She was 29, stunning and wickedly clever in reading people's desires and vulnerabilities. Born in a small town in Michigan, Catherine had grown up watching soap operas on grainy television screens, dreaming of the day she would swap her cramped, mundane life for extravagance and power. She had started off as a receptionist at a mid-tier marketing firm. Thanks to her allure and the innate gift of charm, she quickly gained access to influential men, each step taking her closer to the high life she believed was her birthright. Rumors circulated wherever she went. Some colleagues said Catherine had friends in the upper management who smoothed her career progression. Others claimed she blackmailed an executive into giving her a promotion. Whatever the truth, Catherine climbed rung after rung until she landed a plush position at Maxwell & Co. investment firm. No relation to her own surname, but the coincidence made for an enticing conversation starter. It was at a charity event in Midtown Manhattan, a glitzy fundraiser for the city's underprivileged youth, that Catherine and Richard's paths first crossed. Elizabeth had been scheduled to attend, but was called away due to a family emergency in Connecticut. Catherine was there on her company's behalf, an alluring vision, in a sleek, emerald green cocktail dress. She spotted Richard easily. His magnetism drew every gaze in the room. She waited, timed her approach flawlessly as he excused himself from a conversation with another VIP. "Mr. Harrington," she said, with a soft, intentional lilt, "I'm Catherine Maxwell. I've heard so much about your latest real estate development in Tribeca." Richard was polite, unguarded. "Call me Richard," he replied, a slight smile tugging at his lips. He was used to flattery, but something about Catherine's approach struck him. Maybe it was the subtle confidence with which she looked directly into his eyes, or maybe it was her effortless charm, the same charm that had propelled her career. Throughout the evening, Catherine navigated the room with the same precision. Whenever Richard turned, she was near, offering a witty remark, stepping in with a glass of champagne at the right moment, or finessing a conversation so that their mutual interests seemed perfectly aligned. By the end of the night, Catherine had accomplished exactly what she aimed for. She left an impression on Richard Harrington's mind. Thus began a series of carefully orchestrated coincidences. Catherine happened to frequent the same gym as Richard Maverick Fitness in Soho. She too had philanthropic leanings toward the same children's shelter in Brooklyn that Elizabeth supported. Every intersection was a masterful stroke of planning on Catherine's part, giving her ample opportunities to grow closer and deepen the connection. Onlookers who noticed the blossoming friendship either dismissed it as a business alliance or indulged in quiet speculation. Within a year, Catherine had become a staple in Richard's orbit, always with a new idea, a resourceful angle, or an insightful suggestion about marketing strategies for his real estate holdings. She wore confidence like a diamond necklace. She had an uncanny ability to make him feel revered, as if he were the single most remarkable man on earth. And for a man of Richard's status, who perpetually contended with the burdens and responsibilities of empire, Catherine's attentiveness was intoxicating. When the lines finally blurred, when the business dinners led to late-night drinks and more intimate encounters, Richard convinced himself it was harmless, just a phase, an indulgence, a fleeting fling. He believed he had the power to control the situation, to keep it compartmentalized, far from Elizabeth's world. Richard had no inkling that Catherine's ambitions ran deeper than a single affair. She viewed him not just as an extraordinary lover, but as the golden key to a life of endless wealth and social standing. And from the moment they became physical, Catherine nurtured a quiet, cunning scheme. She would become irreplaceable by any means necessary. Elizabeth Harrington was no naive society wife. She had once been a bright star in the cutthroat world of hedge funds and analytics. She knew how to track data, interpret subtle patterns, and sense shifting dynamics. In the early months, Elizabeth noticed Richard was spending longer hours at the office and returning home with an oddly euphoric mood. Or at times, he was unusually tense, as if weighed down by guilt. Then came the intangible red flags, the work calls that pulled him away from family dinners, the texts he guarded, the sudden hush when she entered the room. Even more telling, Elizabeth found trivial excuses from Richard about why he missed certain philanthropic events they used to attend together. She sensed a third presence, a phantom occupant, in the corners of their marriage. At first, Elizabeth tried to dismiss it as mere anxiety or the result of ongoing stress. The property market was volatile, and Richard was locked in an important bid for a new luxury development near Central Park. She questioned whether she was imagining conspiracies where none existed, yet her heart wouldn't let it rest. So she started asking subtle questions. "Everything all right at the office, or you've been distant lately? You want to talk about anything, dear?" Richard evaded them expertly, weaving half-truths about expansions and branding strategies, insisting he needed to entertain potential investors. For a time, Elizabeth forced herself to believe him. She wanted to protect their marriage more than she wanted to confront him. They had been through so much together, forging a relationship built on mutual respect. Deep in her gut, though, she sensed a new invasive presence in his life. She decided to keep her eyes and ears open, determined to confirm or dispel her suspicions. Her best friend, Miriam Carter, noticed the shift in Elizabeth's spirit and pressed her gently over lunch at the Fifth Avenue Club. Elizabeth confided her fears, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. But it was too early to raise accusations or to fight with Richard without proof. So Elizabeth began to observe Richard's patterns like an analyst. She studied credit card statements, phone records, and schedules. She noted how his calls peaked at 3 p.m. every day, how certain $500 charges at upscale restaurants like Le Pavilion appeared at odd intervals, and how he once visited the Essex house under the guise of a client meeting. She kept the information in a discreet folder labeled Expense Analysis. Her emotions swung unpredictably from heartbreak to anger to a faint flicker of hope that she was wrong. Still, Elizabeth clutched the intangible thread of evidence with a determination only someone who once handled million-dollar hedge fund trades could muster. She vowed she would find answers, because the only thing more devastating than acknowledging the truth was living in blissful ignorance. Meanwhile, Catherine Maxwell's infiltration was nearly complete. She had become Richard's confidant, an indispensable ally in matters both personal and professional. Their relationship extended into after-hours strategy sessions. They would lean over architectural renderings for new condos, share conspiratorial glances when something at a business function amused them, and vanish into side rooms in the hush of midnight. Ever watchful of the precarious balance, Catherine maintained a careful approach. She didn't want to rush to scare him off or push him back into Elizabeth's arms. A cat-and-mouse interplay existed between them, but Catherine always made sure to appear as the cat, the one quietly in control. Her careful planning extended beyond seduction. She read about Elizabeth Harrington, studied her philanthropic involvements, her background in finance, even her sense of style. Catherine gleaned every snippet of info she could from Richard, how Elizabeth often took pride in analyzing feasibility studies, how she hated dishonesty above all else, and how she placed an immense value on trust in marriage. One day, Catherine gleaned a rumor that Elizabeth and Richard had tried for a child for years, but experienced heartbreak. It was whispered Elizabeth had a miscarriage early on, and they never quite recovered from the wound. That rumor was Catherine's key to a future plan. If Elizabeth had trouble carrying a child, Catherine realized that was an angle. In the twisted logic of Catherine's ambition, a baby was the ultimate tool to lock down her millionaire lover permanently. The plan crystallized. She would fake a pregnancy. She'd wait for the perfect storm, some catalyst that would push Richard to consider divorcing Elizabeth. Catherine believed that if she could just place that final wedge between husband and wife, the Harrington empire might eventually become hers. She just needed the right timing, the right moment to strike. The tension between Elizabeth's growing suspicions and Catherine's scheming came to a head in a single pointed moment. The Harrington Foundation organized a huge gala at the Plaza Hotel. Both Elizabeth and Richard were in attendance, joined by a curated crowd of New York's most influential philanthropists and business people. Cameras flashed continuously as the city's elites arrived in their tailored finery. The event aimed to raise money for youth education, a cause dear to Elizabeth's heart. Catherine made her entrance halfway through the evening wearing a gown that managed to be both classy and provocative. How had she ended up on the guest list? Elizabeth had no idea, but her heart nearly leapt from her chest upon seeing the younger woman approach Richard with familiarity. And Richard, for his part, looked flustered and guilty. Attendees whispered amongst themselves as Catherine mingled, making small talk about the Harrington Foundation's philanthropic projects, praising Elizabeth's leadership with a too-sweet smile. Elizabeth's eyes remained on Catherine the entire time, and Catherine did everything she could to project an image of innocent admiration. Richard oscillated between the two women, torn sweaty at the collar, as though he were an actor in a suspense thriller with no lines. To make matters worse, it was in front of the cameras that Catherine approached Elizabeth with a philanthropic donation in the name of a new partnership. Photographers swarmed, capturing the moment of two women smiling, stiffly shaking hands. Elizabeth's smile was as brittle as fine china. Meanwhile, Catherine's glowed with the satisfaction of stepping 1 foot deeper into Harrington territory. That night, back in the privacy of the Harrington penthouse overlooking Central Park, Elizabeth confronted Richard. She demanded the truth, her voice trembling with anger and heartbreak. "What is she doing here, Richard? Why is Catherine Maxwell suddenly popping up everywhere, holding your arm in front of the cameras? She's a contact at Maxwell & Co." That's all he said, his voice low and evasive. "They're potentially funding one of my next developments. It's purely business. She wants to partner with the foundation too." All philanthropic gestures, Liz. Elizabeth's eyes burned with rage. "Don't lie to me." She had never raised her voice like this before, but the dread swirling in her chest left her with no choice. Richard tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away, stepping back, as though the very sight of him repulsed her. "I'm telling you, it's not what it looks like," he insisted. But the quiver in his voice betrayed him. If Elizabeth had harbored any doubts before, that moment crushed them. Days turned into weeks as Elizabeth struggled with the emotional reality of her husband's betrayal. Though Richard never openly admitted the affair, Elizabeth felt the truth in every awkward silence and every vacant look in his eyes. She withdrew from public events, citing stress and exhaustion, while Richard continued to juggle his high-profile responsibilities. She considered leaving him, walking away from their marriage of 8 years from the heartbreak. But Elizabeth also considered her investment in their life together, the philanthropic projects, and the vow they had made through storms and sunshine. She was torn, balancing her dignity against the love she once believed was unwavering. In a cruel twist of fate, Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant 2 months later. She felt a wave of conflicting emotions. This was the miracle she had prayed for, the child she had almost lost hope of ever having. Yet in the midst of heartbreak, how could she find the joy and stability to bring a new life into the world? She visited Dr. Amanda Wu, her longtime OB/GYN, who confirmed the pregnancy. Elizabeth asked the doctor to keep it private for the moment. She wasn't ready to share the news with Richard, uncertain of how he would react. Her only confidant, Miriam, squealed with cautious excitement, hugging Elizabeth in a swirl of tears and happiness. "This is your blessing," Miriam whispered. "No matter what Richard has done, This baby is yours to protect." By now, Elizabeth was wearing the slightest hint of a smile that signaled a faint new hope. She decided to hold off on confronting Richard again until she felt surer of her path forward. In her private moments, Elizabeth would sit in the nursery she had once designed but never used, imagining the future. She wanted one in which her child would grow up in a loving home. But reality was complicated. She knew Catherine Maxwell still lurked in the shadows, claiming a place in Richard's life, intentionally or not. Little did Elizabeth know how deeply Catherine had already woven herself into their marital tapestry, or the shocking gambit Catherine would soon deploy. Catherine Maxwell had studied her prey's every move. She sensed tension between Richard and Elizabeth was at an all-time high. She also discovered through clever eavesdropping and perhaps a well-placed bribe to a medical office staffer that Elizabeth was pregnant. This development threw Catherine's plans into disarray. If Elizabeth carried Richard's child, her entire scheme to become the central figure in Richard's life was jeopardized. But Catherine was not one to retreat. Instead, she took a more aggressive stance. If Elizabeth was pregnant, Catherine would be pregnant too, or at least she would make Richard and the world believe she was. The day Catherine decided to fake her pregnancy, she initiated phase 1 of her ploy forging ultrasound documents. The black and white images looked remarkably authentic. She had practiced altering them, substituting her name for another patient's details. Then she orchestrated a theatrical performance for Richard, arranging a private dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant in Midtown. She chose a corner booth, dimly lit, ensuring no one familiar with them would overhear. When Richard arrived, Catherine wore an air of vulnerability, tears glinting in her eyes. She wasted no time. "Richard," she began, her voice shaky. "I'm pregnant." He felt the world tilt. Confusion and fear flashed across his face, merging with guilt and an odd sense of wonder. Still reeling from his private emotional disarray at home, the news struck him like a thunderbolt. Catherine, reading his expression, slipped forged documents across the table. He stared at them, scanning the medical jargon, the fuzzy ultrasound images. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly, heart pounding in his ears. In that moment, all Richard could think of was the chaos that might ensue. Elizabeth, the marriage, the baby, the scandal. How he whispered, choking on his words. He might have known the literal answer, but the moral question loomed larger. How had he allowed things to reach this point? How was he going to face Elizabeth, their families, the press? Hairs slipped down Catherine's cheeks, a carefully calibrated performance. "I never meant for this to happen," she lied. "But we have to deal with it now." She placed a trembling hand on his arm. "I thought you loved me." Richard was lost in a whirlwind of panic and guilt. Finally, he muttered, "I need to think." With that, he stood abruptly, tossed enough cash on the table to cover dinner, and stumbled out into the cold night air. Catherine watched him leave with a triumphant gleam in her eye. Richard arrived at the penthouse well past midnight. He found Elizabeth awake, sipping chamomile tea by the window overlooking Central Park. She rarely waited up anymore, but on this night, she'd been restless, hormones, racing mind, swirling with her pregnancy and the tension in their marriage. It was impossible to sleep when the foundation of her life felt so perilously unsteady. He closed the door softly, hoping to avoid conversation. But their eyes locked in the darkness, two silhouettes bearing unspoken truths. He approached her slowly, like a guilty child returning home after curfew. Elizabeth stared at him, noticing the disheveled hair, the panic in his eyes. "Where have you been?" she asked quietly. The question echoed between them. Richard hesitated, then sank onto the couch, shoulders sagging. He grappled with the impulse to confess Catherine's claim, but was paralyzed by the thought of further destroying Elizabeth's fragile trust. Still, the weight of the lie was suffocating. Elizabeth turned on a small lamp, casting a warm glow across the living room. She looked into his face and decided to speak. "I'm pregnant, Richard. I've been trying to tell you for weeks." He felt his heart drop, his own wife carrying his child. Tears sprang to his eyes, a tumult of relief, love, and shame swirling. For a second, he wanted to gather her into his arms to express how sorry he was, how much he wanted to fix everything. Yet Catherine's claim hung ominously over his head. "That's wonderful," he said lamely, voice shaking. "Liz, He stopped, burying his face in his hands. Elizabeth waited for him to finish, but he said nothing more. She could sense the anguish in him, see the terror. There was something he wasn't telling her. "Richard, what else is wrong?" She pressed a hand against his shoulder, uncertain whether to comfort or interrogate him. He swallowed. "I made a mistake. It's Catherine. She says she's pregnant. I don't know if it's real, but she showed me an ultrasound." Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. Of all the nightmares she had imagined, this was the worst. She withdrew her hand, pressing it against her own belly protectively. Silence stretched between them, like a vast canyon, echoing with heartbreak and fury. Then she stood up. "This is too much," Elizabeth whispered, tears gathering at the edges of her eyes. "I can't even begin to—" She shook her head at a loss. Richard rose as well, reaching for her. "I'm sorry, Liz. I love you." "I never—" She brushed his hand away. "Don't," she said, voice cracking. "Whatever your intentions, this is the result. I have to protect my baby now, whether or not I can protect this marriage." She turned and left him there in the half-lit living room, the city lights glinting through floor-to-ceiling windows. The echo of her footfalls down the hallway rang like a funeral dirge for their once rock-solid bond. The next days were a fever dream of crisis management. Richard had no idea whether Catherine was truly pregnant or if it was a ruse. Terrified of the scandal, he offered to pay for further medical tests. Catherine skillfully evaded them, claiming she wanted a more advanced screening in a discreet clinic to avoid paparazzi. In private, she started dropping hints about serious health risks as though to elicit his sympathy and keep him too worried to demand real proof. Elizabeth, meanwhile, made an appointment with her attorney, Grace Mayfield. The stoic woman behind Mayfield and Associates was known for handling high-net-worth divorces and asset disputes with razor-sharp efficiency. Elizabeth explained the situation tearfully, but with a measure of resolve. She wanted to know her rights if she walked away from the marriage. She also wanted to protect her unborn child and the Harrington Foundation from any potential meltdown caused by Catherine's claims. Grace was prepared to go on the legal offensive. She recommended gathering more evidence, documents, recordings, anything that might prove Catherine was lying or that she was extorting them. But Elizabeth wasn't sure she wanted a public showdown. She still cared for Richard, and deep down, a piece of her yearned to salvage the marriage. Catherine, capitalizing on Richard's confusion, escalated matters by threatening to expose the affair publicly if he didn't step forward and claim the child as his. She hired a lawyer herself, Joshua Penfield, a cunning figure with a reputation for representing mistresses in high-profile paternity suits. Soon enough, rumors leaked to tabloids that the Harrington family might be in crisis. A few sensational headlines began to appear: real estate mogul's secret love child, and could this woman take down the Harrington empire? Elizabeth's heartbreak morphed into fury. Every fiber of her being rebelled against letting Catherine tear her life apart. She reached out to an old acquaintance, a private detective named Michael Delgado. Back in her hedge fund days, Elizabeth had quietly worked with Delgado to uncover fraudulent transactions. Now, she asked him to unearth every detail he could about Catherine Maxwell, her medical history, her background, her finances. She told Delgado to be discreet, no stone unturned, but no public fiascos unless absolutely necessary. As the lawyers and investigators moved behind the scenes, Catherine ramped up her performance, sporting looser dresses and occasionally touching her flat abdomen, remarking she was just a bit nauseous. She made sure Richard saw these theatrics and received updates on her pregnancy. It was a maddening cycle, with Richard caught in her crosshairs. Finally, the situation exploded into legal action when Catherine, under her lawyer's counsel, filed a paternity suit. The official claimed Catherine Maxwell was carrying Richard Harrington's unborn child, and she demanded immediate financial support and a legal declaration of paternity. She cited emotional distress and financial uncertainty, claiming Richard had attempted to coerce her into terminating the pregnancy. All illusions of keeping the matter private vanished. The suit was filed publicly, the press got wind, and the Harrington name was plastered across tabloids once more, this time with more grim inevitability. Elizabeth watched from the shadows, quietly steeling herself for the battle she knew was coming. On the morning of the court hearing, Manhattan's Civic Courthouse was a hornet's nest of media activity. Reporters lined the steps, jostling for vantage points. Cameramen shouted instructions as lenses zoomed in on any black limousine that pulled to a stop. Lawyers in designer suits streamed in and out of the building, briefcases in hand. Richard arrived with his legal team first, flanked by David Reeves, a top-tier corporate lawyer who had stepped in as crisis manager, and a small cadre of associates. Richard, hair neatly combed back, wore a dark blue suit that did little to mask the sleepless nights etched into his face. He paused on the courthouse steps, swallowing nervously as reporters hurled questions. "Mr. Harrington, did you really father Catherine Maxwell's child? Is Elizabeth Harrington filing for divorce? What will become of your empire if you lose?" He said nothing, pressing through the cluster until he disappeared into the marble lobby. Meanwhile, Catherine Maxwell chose a theatrical arrival. She emerged from a sleek black town car, wearing a modest black dress that draped her figure, perhaps too modest for the flamboyant Mistress. Joshua Penfield, her lawyer, guided her through the paparazzi crush, his expression stoic and triumphant. Catherine placed a hand upon her flat stomach as if warding off stress, an image that tabloids couldn't wait to capture. Inside, courtroom 3C bustled with tension. Pale wooden benches overflowed with spectators, reporters, and curious onlookers. Catherine's lawyers took their seats on the plaintiff's side, while David Reeves and Richard took the defense table. But there was one conspicuous absence. Elizabeth Harrington was nowhere to be seen. As the case was called, Catherine's lawyer launched into a carefully worded statement about Catherine's delicate condition and her alleged emotional harm. He displayed the forged ultrasound images as exhibits, painting Catherine as an innocent victim, scorned by a powerful man who refused to acknowledge his responsibilities. Richard's side, lacking definitive proof that Catherine was lying, kept the defense minimal. David Reeves stressed that they had requested repeated medical verification, which Catherine had not provided. But when asked directly, "Mr. Harrington, do you deny having an affair with Ms. Maxwell?" Richard glanced at the floor and mumbled, "No, but I'm not convinced of this pregnancy until we see more evidence." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Catherine shot Richard a wounded look, as if to say, "How could you question me?" The judge, Honorable Marianne Montgomery, listened intently, her stern gaze flicking between Catherine and Richard. She reminded them that if Catherine were indeed pregnant, a paternity test via amniocentesis could be arranged soon. Catherine's lawyer insisted that procedure was risky for the fetus's health, that Ms. Maxwell was in a high-risk pregnancy, and any attempt to force invasive testing could cause a miscarriage. The tension soared. Spectators craned their necks, sensing that the entire hearing was at a standstill, hinged on whether Catherine was truly pregnant. Richard felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. It looked as though Catherine had found the perfect strategy to stall direct evidence. Just as the courtroom seemed locked in a stalemate, the doors at the back swung open. There stood Elizabeth Harrington, chin held high, a slender figure in a crisp, white, maternity-style blazer, her eyes burning with a fierce determination. In her hand, she clutched a folder. A hush fell over the room, as every eye turned to the woman who had until now avoided the public's gaze. She strode down the aisle, head held high, her composure regal. Reporters scribbled in their notepads. Cameras clicked relentlessly, capturing the moment. Richard twisted in his seat, heart pounding at the sight of his wife. Elizabeth stepped forward and addressed Judge Montgomery. Her voice was clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, may I have permission to present new evidence?" Catherine's posture stiffened. A flash of uncertainty crossed her face. She felt an ominous chill, as if the carefully woven tapestry of her lies was about to unravel. The judge granted Elizabeth permission. With measured calm, Elizabeth approached the bench and handed over the folder. Judge Montgomery opened it, glancing at the documents inside a laboratory analysis sealed with official stamps. The judge's eyes narrowed. She glanced at Elizabeth with curiosity. Elizabeth turned to the courtroom. "I am Elizabeth Harrington, the legal wife of Richard Harrington. I also happen to be pregnant with his child." She laid a hand gently on her growing belly, less a gesture of show and more a sign of maternal protectiveness. A ripple of commotion swept the spectators. Catherine swallowed hard, her composure faltering for the first time. Judge Montgomery rapped her gavel to restore order. Elizabeth continued, "At the advice of my counsel and a private investigator, we secured a prenatal paternity test for my pregnancy. It confirms that Richard Harrington is indeed the father of my child." She paused. "But there's more. We also obtained records from Miss Maxwell's so-called obstetric visits. My investigator found that Ms. Maxwell was never a registered patient at the clinics she cited. She faked these records." Catherine's eyes widened. "That's a lie," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. But the hush in the courtroom stifled her denial. Elizabeth pressed on, unwavering. "We also have a sworn statement from a staff member at Westlake Radiology who recognized the ultrasound images Ms. Maxwell has submitted. They are from a different patient's file taken last year." The color drained from Catherine's face. She shot a desperate glance at her lawyer, who looked equally stunned. Penfield tried to object, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. Judge Montgomery studied the documents carefully, flipping each page. Finally, she spoke. "Ms. Maxwell, can you explain these discrepancies?" Catherine looked cornered, shoulders shaking. She tried to muster some claim. "I was receiving private treatment. Maybe there was an error in my paperwork," but her words rang hollow. The evidence was damning. A hush blanketed the spectators as the reality sank in. Catherine had fabricated the pregnancy from the start. The judge cleared her throat. "Given this new evidence, it appears Ms. Maxwell's paternity suit is grounded in falsehood. The authenticity of Ms. Maxwell's medical claims is in serious doubt. I have reason to believe Miss Maxwell has attempted to deceive the court." Richard exhaled, relief and shock intermingling. His gaze darted to Elizabeth, who stared straight ahead. Inside, his heart thundered with gratitude and fear, because while Elizabeth had vanquished Catherine's lies, their relationship was still a battered ship in a storm. Catherine, seeing her plot in tatters, erupted in fury. She rose, pointing a trembling finger at Elizabeth. "You did this? You're ruining my life." Her voice cracked, resonating with a mixture of desperation and malice. "He never loved you. He only stayed because of your money." That final outburst sealed her fate. Judge Montgomery called for order, banging her gavel and signaling for court officers to escort Catherine out if necessary. As Catherine was led away by her own attorney, a hush lingered in the air, thick with aftershocks of the deception that had just been exposed. The courtroom was still buzzing long after the judge's gavel fell. Reporters scrambled to file their stories, camera crews packed their equipment in a frenzy, and whispers swirled like a storm around the courthouse steps. But inside the sleek black SUV pulling away from the chaos, there was only silence. Elizabeth sat upright, hands folded over her belly, her face unreadable. Richard sat beside her, his expression hollow, shaken, not just by the magnitude of what had happened, but by the woman beside him. He had always known Elizabeth was brilliant, but today she had been unshakable, regal, ruthless even. She had dismantled Catherine's lie with nothing more than truth and resolve. "I'm sorry," Richard said, at last, his voice hoarse. "I don't think I've ever said it in a way that mattered. But I mean it now. I'm sorry for everything, Liz." Elizabeth turned her head slowly. Her eyes were not cold, but they held weight. "You should be," she replied calmly. "Not just for what you did, but for how blind you were. You believed her over me. And worse, you doubted your own child." Richard looked down, shame flooding his features. "I was lost, and I don't expect you to forgive me. Not yet. Maybe not ever." Elizabeth sighed and leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The fight in the courtroom had been exhausting, but it was only the beginning. There would be headlines, legal proceedings, the endless opinions of New York's elite. But none of that mattered compared to the life growing inside her. "This wasn't about revenge," she said, after a long pause. "I didn't do it to embarrass Catherine. I did it to protect my child from being born into a lie, and to remind you and the world who I really am." Richard nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "You reminded me more than anyone ever could." Back at the penthouse, Elizabeth retreated to the nursery. The room had been repainted in warm, earthy tones, with a white crib that still smelled faintly of fresh wood. She stood in the middle of the room, hands on her belly, listening to the quiet hum of the city beyond the glass. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders relaxed. The truth was out, her dignity intact, her baby safe. In the living room, Richard remained on the couch, silent and reflective. The woman he had betrayed had just saved him from total ruin, not with fury, but with unwavering grace. And he knew it would take everything, he had every ounce of effort, to earn a second chance. But for now, Elizabeth wasn't thinking of him. She was thinking of the future, of lullabies and soft blankets, of peace. She had stepped out of the shadows of betrayal and into the light of her own strength. And in that moment she knew she would be just fine. Catherine Maxwell's empire of illusion crumbled overnight. Once, a rising star in New York's elite social circles, she became a cautionary headline splashed across every major media outlet. Mistress fakes pregnancy, exposed by billionaire's wife in courtroom showdown, read one tabloid. From penthouse to perjury, Catherine Maxwell's fall from grace declared another. The whispers that once followed Catherine into charity events and rooftop lounges now turned into open ridicule. The same people who had once complimented her style, laughed at her jokes, and angled for her attention now avoided eye contact, crossing to the other side of the street to escape the storm of her disgrace. Maxwell and Cohn wasted no time distancing themselves. Their official statement was cold and final. Catherine Maxwell was not an executive-level employee, nor authorized to represent the firm in any capacity related to the Harrington matter. We condemn deception in all forms. Her lawyer, Joshua Penfield, dropped her case the day after the hearing. In a terse public statement, he cited irreconcilable ethical conflicts and declined to comment further. Catherine's phone, once constantly buzzing with invitations, now lay silent. The champagne brunches, the rooftop galas, the weekend, escapes to the Hamptons, all vanished like mist in morning light. Worse still, she now faced legal consequences far more severe than social exile. Richard's legal team, under the command of David Reeves, filed a defamation and fraud suit against her, citing reputational damage, emotional distress, and attempted extortion. The forged medical documents and fake ultrasound images were now at the heart of a criminal investigation, and Catherine was under scrutiny for perjury and falsifying evidence in a court of law. She had no savings to fall back on. The lifestyle she flaunted had been funded by Richard's generosity and carefully spun manipulation. Now, with no allies, no legal counsel, and no income, Catherine was forced to retreat to a shabby sublet in Brooklyn, far from the marble floors and panoramic skyline views she had once schemed to make her own. Alone in that cramped apartment, she replayed everything in her mind, the carefully rehearsed lies, the fake tears, the confident strut into the courtroom. She had been so close. One step away from becoming the next Mrs. Harrington, 1 inch from wealth, legacy, and power. And then Elizabeth ruined it. She couldn't erase the image of Elizabeth standing in that courtroom, poised, dignified, and pregnant, holding the DNA test like a sword of truth. That woman had stolen everything, Catherine told herself bitterly. Yet deep down, she knew the truth. No one had stolen anything. She had gambled her future on a lie, and she'd lost. For now, Catherine disappeared from the public eye. Her name became a whisper, a lesson, a reminder that lies, no matter how carefully crafted, eventually collapse under the weight of truth. In the weeks following the courtroom storm, a cautious quiet settled over the Harrington penthouse. The media frenzy gradually subsided, replaced by newer scandals and fresher gossip in the tabloids. But inside the sleek, marble-walled sanctuary above Central Park, Elizabeth and Richard were engaged in a different kind of battle, the slow and painful process of healing. Elizabeth had chosen to stay, not because the betrayal didn't matter, but because she wasn't willing to let a woman like Catherine Maxwell dictate the end of her story. She stayed for her child, for the future that was still unwritten, and perhaps for the parts of Richard that still flickered with sincerity and regret. But staying did not mean forgetting. Under the firm guidance of Grace Mayfield, Elizabeth redrew the boundaries of her marriage. She insisted on financial protections, an ironclad post-nuptial agreement that ensured her child's security, and a clause that guaranteed full custodial rights in the event of future infidelity. These weren't just precautions, they were declarations, lines in the sand that Richard could not cross again. To his credit, Richard didn't resist. He signed every document without protest, as if the ink itself were a symbol of his remorse. But paperwork wasn't enough. Elizabeth needed honesty, so every Thursday evening the two of them sat across from a marriage counselor in a warm, wood-paneled office uptown. There, Elizabeth asked the hard questions, and Richard answered, sometimes through tears, sometimes in choked silence, but always with the effort of a man trying to right his wrongs. "I was weak," he confessed during one session. "I mistook attention for love. I convinced myself it was harmless because I didn't think you'd ever find out. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of how successful you are. Scared I wasn't enough. Catherine made me feel powerful again. And I hate that I let that matter more than you." Elizabeth didn't respond with sympathy. She didn't offer absolution, but she listened. And sometimes she reached for his hand not to forgive, but to acknowledge the humanity in his brokenness. Outside therapy, they returned slowly to the routines of expectant parenthood. They chose paint swatches for the nursery, debated over names, and attended birthing classes together. Every heartbeat on the sonogram, every tiny kick in Elizabeth's belly, was another stitch in the frayed fabric of their marriage. Sometimes Elizabeth caught herself smiling again, unforced real smiles that surprised her. And sometimes, late at night, she'd find Richard standing alone in the nursery, one hand on the crib rail, whispering promises to the child who hadn't yet arrived. They weren't the couple they once were. They were scarred, reshaped. But maybe Elizabeth thought that was the point. Love wasn't about preserving perfection. It was about surviving the imperfections and finding a reason to move forward anyway. And in the stillness of those quiet nights, she was beginning to believe they could. The day Elizabeth went into labor was unlike any other, both terrifying and exhilarating. Richard had just returned home from a late-night business meeting when she doubled over in pain, clutching the edge of the kitchen counter, breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Her water had broken. Without hesitation, Richard swept into action. He grabbed the hospital bag they'd packed weeks ago, helped Elizabeth into the car, and raced through Manhattan's dimly lit streets, his hands trembling on the wheel. The city, which once seemed a jungle of power and pressure, now felt like a tunnel with one purpose: getting Elizabeth to Mount Sinai in time. Inside the delivery room, time slowed. Hours passed in a blur of contractions, encouraging words from nurses and whispered reassurances from Richard, who never left Elizabeth's side. She gripped his hand, sweat coating her brow, tears springing from her eyes, not just from the pain, but from the profound emotional storm surging within her. This was the culmination of everything: betrayal, truth, heartbreak, and hope compressed into one unforgettable night. And then, with one final push and a cry that shattered the silence, Abigail Rose Harrington entered the world. The moment Elizabeth heard her daughter's first wail, something inside her shifted. A rush of fierce, protective love consumed her, erasing every trace of hesitation about what had come before. She looked at Richard, who stood frozen, awestruck, as he held their newborn daughter in trembling arms. Tears rolled freely down his cheeks. "She's perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect." Elizabeth nodded, breathless and raw. In that small hospital room with the lights dimmed and the world momentarily shut out, she saw a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with, the one who once held her hand at a gala and whispered promises of forever. For a moment, they weren't a couple scarred by betrayal or media scandal. They were simply parents bound by the tiny, miraculous life between them. Later, as Elizabeth lay resting, Abigail nestled on her chest, Richard sat beside them, still quiet, in reverence. He looked at his wife with equal parts guilt and gratitude. "I know I've broken your trust," he said, voice hushed. "But I promise from this moment forward, I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild what I broke. For you. For her." Elizabeth looked at him, exhaustion softening her expression. "We're not the same people we were, Richard. And maybe that's okay, because now we begin again." She wasn't promising forgiveness. Not yet. But she was opening a door, a new chapter born not of perfection, but of resilience. A future shaped not by scandal or schemes, but by the choices they would make day by day. In Abigail's gentle breathing, Elizabeth found hope. In Richard's silent tears, she saw the man striving to change. And in her own heart, she discovered strength she never knew she possessed. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Epilogue. Elizabeth emerged stronger armed with the resolve that came from having stared heartbreak in the face and survived. She never forgot Catherine Maxwell's betrayal and the heartbreak that nearly unraveled her marriage. But she also never forgot the resoluteness that allowed her to unveil the truth and protect her child. Richard learned in the hardest way possible that trust once broken is painfully difficult to rebuild. He invested every ounce of effort into becoming a better man, a better husband, and the father he believed his daughter deserved. The birth of Abigail became a turning point that anchored his priorities in family, not just ambition. As for Catherine Maxwell, her downfall served as a cautionary tale across elite social circles. Whispers of her name eventually faded, replaced by new scandals and fresh gossip, but the lesson remained. Lies might dazzle in the moment, but truth has an indomitable power that eventually prevails. In the end, the Harringtons faced a crucible that tore them apart, yet also forged a new bond tempered by fire. Elizabeth could never fully erase the scars, but she carried them with a sense of triumph. She had taken control of her destiny and ensured the life of her child would not be overshadowed by deception, and that in the final analysis was the ultimate victory. Thank you for joining us on this whirlwind journey of high-stakes scandal, heartbreak, and redemption. We witnessed Catherine's faked pregnancy crumble when faced with Elizabeth's undeniable truth, and we watched a marriage teeter on the edge before finding hope in the birth of a precious child. Through twists, turns, and dramatic courtroom showdowns, this story reminds us that lies can tear us apart, but truth and the courage to stand by it prevails in the end. If you found yourself on the edge of your seat, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring more riveting stories that capture the drama, intrigue, and ultimately the triumph of the human spirit. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our next epic saga. Until then, remember, secrets have a way of surfacing, and when they do, only the truth can set you free.